This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country, and we join their calls for justice.
Fuck the police, coming straight from council chambers. A young Jono got it bad because he's brown and not the other colour, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority.
Oh my lord, that was very white.
Yeah, sorry. Did everyone see this? Did everyone see this? Does everyone know Jono's retiring?
He's not retiring, is he? I guess he's
stepping down from his position as Gabba Ward councillor.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
He's saying peace out. After, how long was he in there? He got elected in 2017?
Elected in 2016.
2016, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And has been causing trouble ever since.
Naughty boy.
He said he's out. He's saying, thanks for all the fish. I'm going to do some other stuff. Thank you, Jono, for being Jono and for doing all the great work that you do, annoying all the correct people and fighting against the fucking police.
Yeah.
And then what did he do? He busted out a tune?
Yes. So he announced his resignation on the Sunday, and then on the Tuesday he gave his final speech in the council chamber. And after his speech, I think when councillors were replying, he walks down with a little Bluetooth speaker playing Fuck the Police by NWA. And it's one of those things where you're like, that's embarrassing, but also it's pretty sick. And perhaps it's less cringe when you actually have a history of directly resisting police violence and oppression. So.
Yes, and as we've discussed before with Jono himself, the Queensland police hate him and specifically targeted him.
Actually target him. So yeah,
so he makes a very good point.
Yeah, it's quite funny. I don't know, that they're all just kind of chill about it.
I know no one seems too pissed, which is annoying. It'd be great if you got tackled or something.
I know. I wish they got more mad, but they're all just oh, Jono.
Oh, Jono.
Oh, Jono. Yeah, he's definitely done a little trolling, I think, in his final, week or so. He's having some fun before he officially steps down, and he'll be replaced by Trina Massey, who, by the way, we should maybe have on the show at some point. Mm-hmm. She's a DJ and arts music worker from Brisbane, obviously. Lives in the Gabba, and she is an absolute sick cunt. And I love Trina, and she's going to be such a good counsellor. It's extremely exciting. But yeah, Jono announced his resignation, and in his media release, he puts this list of, things that he might do over the next 12 to 24 months for journalists to just ponder, including things like become a reporter for the Courier Mail, move to Inala and run against Anastasia Palaszczuk, set up a running blockade of the nearest coal mine, run for Coorparoo Ward, take a job with Santos under a fake name and bring it down from the inside, squat in inner city mansions and hotels and turn them into crisis accommodation, write a book, start my own party and call it the Teals to confuse everyone, join the Labor Party because that's how real change happens, live in my camper van, shut down Pink and Bar Detention Centre, learn how to sabotage CSG wells. It's, so many possibilities. We'll just have to wait and see.
Good work, Jono. Thanks, mate.
It's official. The Greens are calling the shots in Canberra. Adam Bandt reminded the Prime Minister who is really in charge, who decides what goes through and what doesn't.
Frankly, I've always found the Greens to be a real serious danger to Australia. A serious danger to Australia.
Hey, this is Serious Danger. This is a podcast about green politics in Australia. It's episode 69.
Nice! I went back. Someone said that they were listening to the podcast and they said they were listening to the first episode just to scare me because it's probably bad. But I went back and listened to it and remembered how we literally started this podcast with us talking about sex toys and then for our political podcast about the Greens.
Oh, yes.
We haven't done enough the Greens are the horniest party content lately. We need to do...
we did a whole episode on sex stuff.
We did a whole episode, but it's been a while. It's the 69th episode. We shouldn't be talking about, the New South Wales election,
the horniest,
and fucking safeguard mechanism and climate change and everything. We should just be talking about horny little Greens babies.
This is not an official Greens Party podcast. It's made possible with the help of the Green Institute and Michael the Griffin. Those are the topics this week. Yeah. The Green slide in New South Wales that occurred.
You heard it here first.
Citation needed, yes. And we're going to be joined by journalist Nick Feik to discuss whether the Greens capitulated, sold out, folded when it came to the government's safeguard mechanism climate legislation. Big week for the party. We're going to go through exactly the concessions that won by the Greens and talk through the politics and how we're feeling about that and work through our emotions.
Talk about our feelings and get it all on the table. Before we do that, we want to thank our new patrons. We have Callum, Zane, Chris S, Oxyhio,
OXYHYO, I don't know. Yep.
Comrade D's, Susie James, and Kenny.
Thank you very much for your support. $3 a month. That's all we ask for to help support the show. We'd appreciate that. You get bonus content every couple of weeks. We release a special little patrons-only episode. So sign up for that if you can. Also, disclaimer, we're recording this before the results of the Aston by-election as well.
Oh, yeah.
Good luck and love to all
birthday.
the Greens volunteers out there who are going for it. Also, Donald Trump might be arrested.
Oh, yeah, I
some
saw
point.
there's the thing for, I got a news alert.
Yes. He's been indicted by a grand jury, and I still don't entirely know. All my knowledge about that comes from Law & Order is for you.
The warrant is out for Trump's arrest.
There it is.
Arrest imminent.
Jesus Christ. Well, that'll work out fine, I'm sure. I'm sure he'll be brought to justice and it won't
absolutely held to account.
It won't help his victim mentality at all. But anyway, just a disclaimer that whatever happens with that, we didn't know about it, okay?
We didn't know. Sorry, we're from the past.
I see a bad moon rising. I feel election on the way. I see the major parties fighting. I see it's Independence Day. Don't stuff around tonight. We're bound for the fight. There's a crossbench on the rise.
Speaking of the past, but also kind of still happening, let's check in on the still being counted results from the New South Wales state election that happened last Saturday. Things are still happening. We haven't confirmed a few seats at the time of recording, which is Friday morning. We had 3 or 4 seats still in doubt, depending on who you ask. Labor was sitting on 45, maybe 46 seats, just short of their 47 majority, like the 47 seats needed for a majority, which must just be excruciating, right? And those 3 or 4 that are still in doubt look like they'd be against the Libs. It's not like there are any kind of minors in play there. It's them or the Libs for those. Well, Libs and Nats. Libs and Nats are on 32 seats. The Greens have 3.
Greens. That's
3.
us.
That's us. The Independents have 9 seats in the
many.
lower house. That's so crazy to me because I was saying, in Queensland we have 1 independent and that's crazy. But even though Labor doesn't have their 47 seats that they need for a majority, they like multiple of the independents have guaranteed supply, so they will form government, and they won't need the Greens in the lower house. So not that exciting, TBH, but interesting when there was. Did Anthony Green call it that?
It's certainly
on
the
election
narrative
night that it was
changed
going to be a
very
majority.
quickly. Yes, there was
I know
talk
he
of
called it. He was
landslide, probably majority. Yes, that's certainly not been the way that things are settled out.
Not quite the case. Quickly, I think the upper house is somewhat interesting. I'm not 100% clear. This may not be 100% accurate because they don't report on it as kind of clearly. But my understanding is it's looking relatively progressive. Labor has picked up 9 additional spots in the Legislative Council, and that's in addition to their existing 8. The Libs and Nats have picked up 6 in addition to their 7. The Greens 1, 2, so that'll bring us to 4 because we had another 2, I think. Pauline Hanson's One Nation, i.e. Mark Latham, 1, boo. Legalized cannabis, sounds good, 1, but it's Jeremy Buckingham, alleged sexual assaulter and shit cunt, former, a Greens defector who has that hilarious video of him vomiting, retching his guts up at the dead fish. That's a good video, to be fair. So the shape of the upper house is looking relatively progressive because they've got Animal Justice Party person in there. It's not too bad. It'll be okay.
So Latham is back in there. Is that right?
Yeah,
okay,
I'm pretty sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Good Lord. And it's worth mentioning the other story with him was him tweeting some absolutely homophobic nonsense that could see him kicked out of the party maybe. Pauline isn't happy, so I guess we'll see.
Pauline was like, look, this is too far even for me. This is such an indication, right, that it's like now that we've got trans people to fucking hate and harass and use as a political football and like violently abuse. We're okay with just the regular gays.
Yes.
So you can't be mean to the regular gays. Mark Latham made these really horrific homophobic tweets, something about like sticking your dick up a man's ass, having a go at the independent MP, Alex Greenwich, is it?
Greenwich, yeah.
Alex, yeah. Really fucked up. And Pauline Hanson was like, it's making us look bad, Mark. So I don't like it,
Well,
what she said.
That's cancel culture from Pauline, I'd say.
Exactly. I think that's fucked up and she should allow his free speech.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. So initial takes on the election, Tom, go.
Well, it was, and what, there's like a 0.8% swing to the Greens, I think, totally on the
I didn't even look at our statewide. Yeah, something like that. It's like, what?
No, I think it could be a negative 0.2% swing against us. So yes, not a tremendous result, you would have to say, generally speaking, in terms of from a Greens perspective. I think, there were some positive swings in certain seats, the kind of seats that we identify as long-term Greens wins, particularly in the inner west. And again, thanks and congrats. And I don't want to talk shit on anyone who worked their guts out to try and do everything they could to make it go well. But you have to say that the strategy was sort of either not cutting through, or maybe the aphorism that when there is a change of government, Greens from Liberal to Labor, when Labor's trying to win government, maybe the Greens don't always do as well as they could.
What 2022
gave that to a lie. Yes, gave it a lie, but maybe it reverts to the mean. I don't know. Maybe general wisdom doesn't mean anything if it changes election to election. But look, it's a shame. I was really stoked that Balmain stayed in Greens' hands. So that's the first time that we've had a retiring MP, Jamie Parker, then pass on to another Greens candidate for them to hold that seat. So I think that was good with all the talk around it, and it was very close, massive swing to Labor in Balmain. But Kobe Shetty, who I used to work with at Movember, will be the new member for Balmain.
There you go. Yeah, that's really good news. It was very unclear on election night, and for some time it was looking like maybe it would go to Labor, but it's been called for the Greens now, which is really good. So that's despite an 8.4% swing to Labor, and we lost about 2% off our vote. That's in the context of last election, and I want to go through, the Greens results in more detail and look at some of these seats because I think it's interesting. In Balmain in 2019, they had a Keep Sydney Open candidate, which took 4.6%, and they also had an Animal Justice Party candidate, which took 2.2%. So you take those into consideration, and it looks as though a lot of that has kind of gone. Well, we don't know directly where that vote has gone, whether some of it's come to us and we lost other votes to Labor, or what's happened there, but that's worth noting as well. So yeah, the Greens results, maybe we'll get to that first, because we won an extra senator. We re-elected Kate, and we won Amanda Cone, which I was like, that's no fucking easy feat. Winning another. Do they call them senators actually at state level? I don't know about this because we don't have an upper house. This is a real question. Do you call them senators? No.
Legislative councillor. Yes.
A legislative councillor. That's too long. Well, they won one of those. But I was like, that's great. But then I realized actually that was just restoring our existing kind of vote level. Right. It's not increasing our vote. It's because we lost one in 2019. I don't remember this somehow, but Justin Field, who was a Greens MLC, just dipped right after the election like a fucking dog rat. I don't know what the context was. When I looked at it very briefly, he was like, oh, the party's so divided. I guess this was when that was the narrative about New South Wales. Right. And he's now an independent. So we pretty much were just winning that back on the quota, the vote level that we already had, right?
Right, yeah, restoring to the mean. And look, Amanda Cone is awesome. She's from Albury.
Yes, I have her on the podcast.
Yeah, she'd be great. She's a doctor. She was spending a lot of the campaign going to regional areas talking about the crisis in regional health infrastructure and how that sucks and we need to do way better. I met her when I did that fundraiser in Albury. Absolute legend. The fact she's up there is really good news.
Yeah, so we did that. We retained Balmain. We retained Ballina and Newtown, our two other seats that we needed to, both with positive swings. Great. But again, interesting, when you drill into the details, some of those positive swings could be explained by the absence of other minor players. So, for example, Newtown, massive positive swing for Jenny Long, who fucking rules, 10.5% swing. But worth noting that in 2019, Keep Sydney Open had 7.3% and AJP had 2.5%. So with the absence of those candidates, it's kind of unsurprising that our vote would increase. It would bump up again.
Sure.
in Ballina, there was a 3.9% swing towards Tamara Smith there. No Animal Justice Party that time. They had around 2.5% of the vote last time. One thing I think is concerning and interesting in Ballina is a really high vote for the independent Kevin Lowry there, 7.8%. And that is not a teal independent by any means. That is a nut job conspiracy theorist indie. So my mum was almost suggesting we go to his candidate forum just to hear him be absolutely insane. But we're talking like full on red-pilled climate change denier, New World Order kind of guy. And he got 7.8%. I don't know if that's just because people in that area wanted to support an independent and thought that it was a progressive independent, or if it really is capitalizing on that kind of, conspiracy theorist, anti-vax, sovereign citizen stuff in the Northern Rivers. But that's a thing.
And just so Ballina would sit in the federal seat of Richmond, which Mandy Nolan ran in the federal election. Is that right?
Yeah, part of it.
Overlap. Okay.
I don't know if it's wholly within Richmond, but it's certainly, like a lot of those seats, like in terms of Byron Shire and the Northern Rivers, that's overlap there.
Okay.
Other seats that the Greens were targeting the only seat that we saw a significant swing against us in was the seat that we really wanted to win or thought that we could win if we just held our vote, which was Lismore. Labor had almost a 20% swing there. We lost more than 11% on the current vote count, which is like, what the fuck? This is the seat that was fucked over by floods and a candidate who supports new coal and gas has beat out a Greens candidate. The narrative that I've heard there is that Janelle Saffin, the MP, is just very popular, and maybe there's a sense that she was, even while broader government figures weren't good during the floods, maybe she was a good local member. But I'm sure there'll be lots of like soul searching about what happened in Lismore, and I don't think that they had necessarily a big field campaign. And obviously it's it's difficult in more rural areas to have a good field campaign. But yeah, it's sad that we didn't pick up Lismore, and I think obviously we're now further away than we're inching further away rather than closer to winning that seat, perhaps, unless there's another retirement. In Albury, which was the seat that was kind of, an outside chance thing, that's literally just zero change. There was that retirement there. And, that was South Coast. Was there a retirement in Albury? No.
I think that, yes. I think
there was.
MP was sitting down. I think,
yeah, maybe. Okay. But there was, our Greens vote literally changed. It's just the same. There were swings to a lot of the like small parties there, kind of minor swings to Shooters and Fishers, as well as Animal Justice Party, which is funny, and the Lib Dems. South Coast, a 2.1% swing towards us, but a massive swing off the retiring Liberal MP. Must have had a kind of big personal vote. They lost 20%.
Jesus.
There were like increases in the vote to Shooters and Fishers and the Independent, and Labor's won that seat. We were unsuccessful. Big swing from the Liberals to a popular Labor MP in Heffron, where we only picked up less than 1%. In Summerhill, one of the potentially is that our biggest non-income, like our biggest insurgent campaign swing in the state, 4.2%. There was a big swing to Labor in that seat though. And I think and off the Liberals.
Right.
Worth noting that Summerhill had a really exciting, like kind of, renters focus campaign. Which we spoke about in, was that last episode? Wow. Seems like longer ago than that.
2 weeks ago, I think.
2 weeks ago. Okay. Yeah. All right. And a big door knocking campaign. So I don't know. I just think that's interesting. I think that, in general, I would characterize this election for the Greens. Like, I don't think that it's a negative result. I don't think that it's embarrassing. I think that it is disappointing because I think we wanted to, I think all of us wanted a really exciting, massive, another green slide. We want it to be really exciting. We had high expectations, a lot of us. And so it's kind of just like boring. It's like, we've kind of held our vote. We've held our seats. That's what we've done.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about the door-knocking numbers and the kind of meaningful conversations numbers, which were, were decent in Summerhill when we talked to ISO, but I think you commented at the time that statewide the numbers surprised you coming from the capital of door-knocking in Greensland. I mean, we know it works. I don't think anyone's denying the fact that it works. Building the capacity, having the resources, energizing people to get out there and do it is a whole other matter.
That's the thing. I think that it's interesting. I think there's really an acceptance across the country that door knocking in a massive field campaign is essential, and particularly was essential in the wins in Queensland. And there's a lot of people who are like, yes, we want to do that here, but don't really. It's scaling up that I think is the real challenge that people maybe haven't quite grasped how to do yet. And there's a lot of those campaigns, even where they're having, they're trying to door knock, but it's falling on the candidate and maybe their campaign manager and like one or two other people to door knock. And it's just not enough. I mean, in Griffith, they had, I think, like 6, local teams that were then like it needs that exponential expansion where then they have got, a core group of 10 or 20 in each area of the electorate, 6 areas of the electorate who are door knocking every single weekend, multiple times. And that's how you get those massive, massive numbers of conversations. And that really is what you need if you want to have those results. So like, I think, and yeah, I know that there are a lot of people and there's a lot of energy for some training and expanding, like sharing that knowledge throughout the party of how you really scale up. So I do think it's possible.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting as well, like we touch on, what role the platform and the comms might have played in our result in the election. There was sort of like from some areas, there's this big focus on housing, which is really important. But I thought it was very notable that on election night, when I'm watching ABC, the first live cross to a Greens party, a Greens function, the first and only question that the journo asked, I think it was Kate, was about cashless gaming card, which is like,
right.
That's not what you want to be talking about on election night, right?
Right. Yeah. So you think the emphasis on that around the campaign or letting that issue, I mean, clubs in New South Wales is extremely powerful apparently, and doing got a pretty strong grip, particularly on the Labor Party. Managed to control or push that issue, and then the Greens were either forced to or found themselves in a position where they were talking about that when they should have been talking about other shit. Yeah,
and I think a lot of the liability for that lies with media, who for some reason just love the cashless gaming card issue maybe because it's one of those things that it's like kind of easy to determine the differences with this little policy area between the parties, so you can roll out your comparison articles and you understand the key players, and it's this really kind of political journalism, like it's a good political journalism story. And so, but yeah, like I think it's absolutely primarily the media's fault for just focusing on that when really they should have asked about fucking housing or health or cost of living, education, something that ordinary people would have been thinking about how this is going to impact them on election night.
Big shout out to Bevan Shields at the Sydney Morning Herald for endorsing the coalition too, by the way, everyone.
Well done. Yeah.
Just incredible stuff.
Always good shared. I mean, yes, but I think that yes, there's media culpability, but obviously there's also culpability on the party for allowing that to happen. And I do think, listing balance of power demands was a good idea, that to try and push that angle that maybe we could be in balance of power and this is what we want, when it was looking somewhat possible, sure, but it wasn't looking that possible. It wasn't really, a huge part of the narrative as I understood it. And yet we released a list of 7 demands, including stuff like the cashless gaming card, where Labor already kind of, it was a Libs versus Labor issue. It wasn't something that the Greens had ownership of. It wasn't like in the federal election where the Greens launched their balance of power demands, and it was these really clear demands that were distinct from both the major parties and had us as this powerful third force where we're the only one talking about stopping coal and gas. We're the only one talking about taxing billionaires. We're the only ones talking about bringing dental into Medicare.
Right.
And so that was so incredibly clear and powerful. And I think we kind of lost that for the Greens in New South Wales. My take.
We shall see.
Yeah, we shall see. So, but in the meantime, yes, the Greens are sadly not really part of the story. That's not a terrible thing because the story isn't, wow, Greens on the decline after initial, blip in 2022. Now they're over. But no, the take is about between Labor and the Libs. And particularly, I think that a lot of the discourse is around why the Libs vote is falling, right?
Yes, well, every state and territory government in the mainland is controlled by Labor, or Labor and the Greens in the ACT, which is, I think someone pointed out that the Greens are in government more than the Nationals in this country at the moment, which is a very cheeky stat that kind of doesn't make much sense. But we'll take it.
It's quite funny. Yeah, I mean, someone also pointed out that now, like the Brisbane City Council, which is very, very heavily LNP dominated, is like top. They're the top dogs of for the coalition on the mainland, which makes it even more important that we fucking kick them out next year in 2024 council elections. Well, best of luck to the New South Wales Liberals for figuring out who they are.
Good luck, comrades. Really big Greens news this week was the deal that the federal Greens reached up to a flying start. The Greens reached a deal with the Labor government on the safeguard mechanism. They won some concessions in return for the support for this climate legislation. And the question is, did they sell out? Are they fucking traitors? Is it a win? Is it a loss? Is it somewhere in the middle? These are the questions that we're asking.
We're all going to die.
Are we all going to die? Yeah. Nick Feik has been following the Safeguard shit show very closely. He's a journalist, former editor of The Monthly. In the most recent edition of The Monthly, he wrote a piece called The Great Stock and Coal Swindle, which was extremely depressing and fascinating. He laid out the wildly dodgy world of carbon offsets, which the safeguard mechanism depends on, the failures of the safeguard mechanism, and wrote stuff like this. It seems easier for our federal government to contemplate the destruction of our planet than to impose laws that might crimp fossil fuel company profits. The price of our survival is the rapid cessation of fossil fuel use. The expansion of the industry is not consistent with our safety on Earth. How hard is this to understand? A very good question to talk about this week's news. We welcome Nick to the show. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for...
No worries. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. There's a lot of sort of detail to get across here, and we also want to talk about the politics of it and either reassure or inform Greens supporters or people listening to the show that they should take to the streets. I guess we'll figure it out together. I saw you tweet, "Don't fold Greens," in the week leading up to this negotiation. How are you feeling going into this week when the Greens were going to make this call on safeguard? Were you hopeful? What were your expectations? How are you feeling about it?
Yeah, look, I'd heard that they were reaching a deal, and I just thought, I hope it's not a deal that amounts to nothing. I mean, I've been a strong supporter of their attempts to tighten the safeguard, but there's always a question about how much the Greens can get done. And I think the complication in this circumstance was that a lot of the bigger environmental groups like the ACF and the Climate Council just weren't providing a lot of institutional support for the Greens position. You would have noticed a very strong sense of, from those organisations and then all the way through business, all the way through the mainstream media, there was a lot of kind of pressure to just pass it and then we'll improve it, or pass it with a few small amendments. My view was that this was a terrible position to negotiate. I thought what the big environmental NGOs were doing was weak because the original safeguard legislation, the safeguard mechanism itself, as it stood in the original Labor, in the Labor version of it that was proposed, and that it was negotiated upon, I thought that was such a bad piece of work. So just to give listeners a sense of what was being offered by Labor to the Greens and what was being supported by, most of the media, was a mechanism by which that applied to the top 215 polluters in Australia, and it would essentially say we're going to reduce our emissions by a certain amount each year out to 2030, but you can buy offsets if you can't reduce your emissions. Now, without wanting to go into the whole deep kind of complex history of offsets, in 2 words, I can tell you what offsets are. They're shit, right? There's so much money spent on trying to shuffle paper around, and people make up schemes where they're not going to cut down trees anymore, but they said they were, so now they're going to get a credit because they're not, but they weren't going to do it anyway. Or, there's people saying that they're planting forests in the middle of the Nullarbor and they're going to grow big and strong and we're going to collect credits on them for 20 years. These are the sorts of schemes. It's not just me saying this. Andrew McIntosh and a group of academics from across the country have looked at all of the major offset methods, and their view is that between 70 and 80%, probably closer to 80% of all the offsets in Australia are dodgy, right? So these are the offsets that were being used.
Well, that's 20% that are good. So why don't you be a little bit more positive, Nick?
That's because 20% they couldn't look at because there's no data available for them.
So they couldn't definitively say that they're shit.
It's really terrible. Like, genuinely, the data that's available to the public is so limited, and the system just kind of stinks. I wrote a long essay based on a lot of research about offset, and discovered some really terrible things. Like the fossil fuel industry is now investing in the carbon offsets industry because it's much cheaper to buy offsets than to actually reduce emissions. This is just it's just an economic thing. It's just cheaper. And if you're a gas company, right, when you're expanding your gas operations, which is happening all over Australia, if you're expanding, you're not reducing emissions.
No.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
You're not. So the system is that they can just buy offsets and then say they're heading towards net zero. Well, there's no one's heading to actual zero. Net zero means that for each emission you're not cutting, you're buying an offset.
It's crazy. People should definitely read your piece. I mean, you really laid out also all that creepy, closeness between the fossil fuel industry and the amount of invested interests in setting up an Australian carbon offset market. Really worth people's time. Of course, we also know the safeguard mechanism allowed for new fossil fuel projects, new coal and gas, which was a key demand for the Greens. That's what we ran on. And we said, this is it. Follows the advice of the International Energy Agency and the UN. We had the IPCC report. We talked about this on last week's show and including the fracas between the Greens and those environmental movements. So then we come to the start of this week, a negotiation is announced, a deal is announced. And I think if we just spend a little bit of time on this, as you understand it, Nick, can you kind of lay out exactly what concessions the Greens have won when it comes to their support for the safeguard mechanism this week?
Yeah, so the main concession that was announced was that there was now a hard cap on actual emissions. So what they announced was that you couldn't just offset your way to the target, that there needs to be an actual cap on the amount of actual emissions. So that was a win. There were also concessions on new gas plants that they would have to offset from day zero, have a net zero target from day zero. I'll go into the detail of that in a minute. There were also concessions about the use of some methods of offsets. Look, to be honest, guys, I think that on each of these concessions, there's a big kind of hole in them.
Yeah.
I think that what we saw in the end is that, what Adam Bandt said was right. He said negotiating with the Labor Party is like negotiating with the gas and fuel industry. And the Labor Party seem more scared of Woodside than they do of climate change. And look, to me, what the net result of the amendments is that there's slightly more pressure and there's a general vibe that we can't just blow the roof off the kind of caps. But in terms of rapid reductions, I don't see it. I don't see it at all. And there's a variety of reasons. I'm probably going to have to get a little bit technical with some of them. Are you ready for that?
Try us.
I'm ready, baby.
I'll try you. Okay. So this idea of reaching like 35-40% reduction by 2030, the idea was that the safeguard would reduce the annual tonnes of emissions from 140 to 100 by 2030. Okay. So we were told that this was written into the amendments, but in actual fact, it's still net emissions that are going to fall by that amount. So they can still use offsets to get to that amount. So I don't see that as a significant change. They've said that there's also a cap. They've said that real emissions need to decline. What they didn't say is that they need to decline at the same rate. They only need to decline by, not down to 100 from 140. They just need to decline. So there is an actual cap, but the cap is not falling by 5% per year. It's falling by, it could be as small as 1% per year.
Mm.
Is that making sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So in my reading and in the other experts I've been speaking to, our reading is that the actual hard cap is not falling at the same rate. It's not getting us to a 40% reduction in real emissions cuts.
Mm.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that, look, even that is written, the way that it's written, the legislation only clarifies that this is the policy intent. There's no actual mechanism, right? There's no actual mechanism in the legislation that requires individual companies to actually cut their emissions. There were no amendments introduced that will change the behaviour of individual companies, which means that when we get to 2030 or close to 2030, it's going to be in the Labor minister, the government, the minister's hands. It'll be his responsibility to ensure that the cap isn't breached.
Mm.
Okay, so keep that in your head for a moment. Now, if the cap's breached, is it going to be a Labor government? Is it going to be a Greens government? Is it going to be a Liberal government? Is it going to be the same minister? Is it going to be someone who turns around and says, well, I didn't make that cap? The minister can then turn around also and change the rules.
Mm.
This is written into the legislation. They can change the rules if they breach the cap. So it's not a hard cap. That's not a very hard cap if you're coming along and saying, well, if we don't reach it, we can change the rules.
Mm.
That doesn't feel like a hard cap to me. So, but I mean, the intent, and this is the Greens argument on all of this, is that the policy intent is there and that it imposes a lot of political pressure on the Labor Party, right? So when I said, the onus isn't on individual companies, it's on the minister, the Greens would see that as a political victory because then from now on they can turn around and each time we're not hitting that target, they'll say, well, this is the legislation the Labor Party passed. And the onus is on the minister responsible to make a change.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And so does that mean, is this related to, obviously, as Tom said, the biggest demand that we had coming into this is that we should not approve any new coal and gas projects. And part of the take is that we capitulated on that key demand because we didn't get that commitment. But it seems to me like maybe this concession is designed to be like sitting under that frame because the argument is that particularly as I understand it, the caps or the requirements for emissions reduction will now apply across all these industries rather than for the individual polluters. So rather than them having to cut it, to achieve certain cuts themselves, there is an overall budget that applies across the industry and the minister will, have responsibility for that. And so then when they look at new approvals in particular, which is the primary kind of responsibility that they will have, would be they'd have to weigh up whether a new coal or a new gas project will blow that budget. And that could help stop new coal and gas. And so I wonder if I think I am confused about what the Greens are saying is the hard cap and whether it's just what they mean by that is just bringing all of these individual polluters under one cap rather than an individual kind of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
and that's the argument for it. It's that the minister is responsible for looking at like new entrants, balancing up all of the players in the entire market and saying, well, we're about to hit that cap, so we therefore can't approve this new gas plant or this new coal mine or whatever, because otherwise we'll breach our cap and it will be against the policy intent, etc. The contrary position is: have you ever met a Labor minister that won't approve a gas mine? Like their policy position generally is to support the export of new gas.
Yeah.
So they will find every way that they can to approve things, to approve new mines. And look, in my view, they'll do everything they can to keep gas export operations expanding.
Well, just this week, Tanya Plibersek approved a new gas processing plant linked to a new onshore gas field out to 2063. I mean, happening exactly the same week as all this stuff went through. So,
and people need, like, let's try and keep these two things in our head at the same moment. How can you be mining gas out to 2063 when you're net zero by 2050?
Yeah, which is not even enough by itself.
You can't offset your way to zero when you're opening and expanding gas plants. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
It's all if what's possible are gigantic kind of accounting scams, which, this is what these offsets are. But because the other thing people need to bear in mind is that these big gas operations that they're opening, they're like 80 to 90% export. That's the net result.
Yes.
That's what they're trying to get at, right? So that 80 to 90% of gas isn't even being counted in our national figure. So everything that we've talked about so far doesn't apply to more than 4/5 of the gas that's going to result from these Australian new gas ventures.
Yes.
So
it's not
they
even a
can
conversation
offset-
we're having.
I know, right?
Yeah.
They can offset 10%. They can offset like 10 to 20% of the entire product that they're mining, and that can be called net zero. This is how you have this ludicrous thing where you're talking about net zero by 2050, but you're opening new gas and coal mines.
What you have to understand, Nick, is because the borders of Australia go all the way up to the atmosphere, right? So if it's not burnt here, then we'll be okay, right?
We'll be okay.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, so everyone else they have to reduce all their emissions, but us being the dealer, we don't have to.
It doesn't matter.
Oh, we don't have to worry about anything.
I don't know about you, mate.
Yeah.
I'm focused on the fucking Aussie climate, all right? The bloody true blue Aussie climate.
Yeah.
That's where
Aussie warming, we're going to stop it.
At the moment. Yeah,
that's superb. Okay, well, then we're going to be fine. And we've got so much land to plant kind of these trees that no one's actually clocking, no one's actually looking at, no one's measuring anything. But, there's an endless supply of carbon offsets. So, we should be okay.
You referred to the nullarbor, is that how you pronounce it, right? And that, I mean, if people hadn't seen this already, that when you look at that, it literally means no trees in Latin. That's where they're doing these offsets.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's just, it bears belief what, the Chubb Review was appointed to look at the carbon offset system. And they looked at it for 6 months and then came back and said, oh, no, it's actually – there's a few problems, but it's actually fine. What we didn't hear is that 3 of the 4 people on that review are involved in carbon offset, like trading.
Yes, like someone during the review was literally telling people it's a great investment while the review was conducting. Yeah, it's extremely dodgy. All right, just before we move on, I just want to clarify again some of these other things, just so we're aware of the deal that the Greens have got and the way the Greens are selling it as justified. So according to the Greens and Adam Band, this new version will mean that 116 proposed projects won't go ahead by that hard cap idea. That's kind of the estimate that he's put on there on those new fossil fuel projects. They're saying that the Beetaloo, they won the chance to Beetaloo, the whole thing has to be offset on all the emissions. That's a big financial barrier, which could potentially sink the Beetaloo, according to Adam. Require all new offshore gas fields to be net zero from the offset. There was some wins on dodgy offsets, the Greens are saying. Low integrity offset generating human-induced regeneration. Australian carbon credits will be stopped until they go through an independent audit. So again, another review that will maybe give us the same result. We don't know. But that could take up to a quarter of future offsets out of circulation. And a little bit on subsidies for the coal and gas industry as well. So trying to reduce that. The Powering the Regions Fund isn't going to be funding coal and gas, and some of the subsidies that are going to the fossil fuel industry have been wound back.
I think that latter one is a win.
Okay.
I think with Beetaloo, the Northern Territory, this is The reason that Beetaloo is treated different from other gas fields is because the Northern Territory government had already done some deals on Beetaloo. They needed to sync up their arrangements with the new incoming safeguard arrangements. Essentially, it means, and again, we're only talking about the Scope 1 and 2 emissions, or the Scope 1 emissions, not the larger Scope 3 emissions. Essentially, it means that Beetaloo just needs to buy more offsets.
Right.
That's going to be the net result.
Which will make it harder for their business case, though, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it is a financial penalty. I don't think it's enough, but we'll see. It is a financial penalty, and we'll definitely hand that one to the Greens. The human-induced regeneration method that they were talking about, not using those offsets anymore, that was already being changed, and they've replaced that method already with a different method that's basically exactly the same with a different name. All the problems that have been identified with that method, this is a carbon offset method, all the problems that have been identified won't affect the fact that all of those carbon credits are still live, they're still in the market, they're still being used and traded, and they're being used to offset emissions. So that one sort of looks good, but I don't think it's a significant one. So what we're talking about generally, I think, across the whole safeguard is just a little tightening of some of the things that'll make some of these big polluting ventures slightly more expensive.
What do you think of the claim that this will sink half of those proposed projects? Do you think they're Adam's sort of taking the piss there a little bit, or do you think that's a realistic idea that half of the 116 proposed projects might not go ahead?
I think it's pulling a number out of a hat, personally. It's probably going to reduce some, I would say. But look, on the scale that we're talking about, okay, I'll give you one example. The Woodside's new Scarborough project is going to produce, and this is across all of the emissions I'm talking about, as in the ones that are burned overseas as well as in Australia. That project is going to produce 1.4 billion tonnes of carbon equivalent emissions. 1.4 billion. So it's more than 30 million per year. Okay, that one project is more than the total abatement of all of the safeguard mechanism facilities. As in, there's more abatement. It's going to outweigh every single reduction that the safeguard mechanism is legislated to make.
Well, fuck.
And that's assuming it all works as well.
Shit.
Yeah. So this is why the Greens are so right in pursuing the no new coal and gas thing, because what we're talking about is Australia supplying the rest of the world with so much gas and not counting all the stuff we're sending overseas. That's why. I mean, the crazy thing about all this is, you know, we don't even collect income tax on these from these gas companies. It's just like they're obviously collecting royalties from them. But the idea that you can't stop them, there's something I don't understand about the relationship between the Labor Party and the gas companies. I just don't think it comes down to donations.
No, there's
the
certainly
donations
something.
just aren't big enough.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like there is, I mean,
there's a cultural issue.
A culture, like an ideological kind of attachment to fossil fuels, and there is, obviously a politicization of climate action and fossil fuels in this country that Labor cannot shake. What I'm really curious about is whether this deal that the Greens have done and the result, the fact that the safeguard mechanism has now, has passed the lower house, whether that has hampered our ability to fight against new coal and gas, because the messaging was certainly, we've done this deal on Labor's safeguard mechanism. That's one thing. Now the fight continues to stop new coal and gas. But is everyone else buying that? Are media going to keep covering our demand for new coal and gas when we've just, in the eyes of the public, I think, capitulated on our key platform on which to achieve that demand?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I mean, I think this is why Adam Bandt was talking about, knocking the number down to 100 and whatever, halving the number of new coal and gas feels it would be viable, because he's also trying to say, but there's still the other half left. That the number, it's a moot point. There's still a lot more work to do. Look, I think from the Labor Party's perspective, they just don't want to talk about this ever again.
Yeah.
They don't want to talk about climate change. They think that they've managed to wedge the Greens into agreeing to something. I think that was always their intention, was to get something through to try and make the Greens look obstructionist on the way through. The Greens, I think, have avoided looking like obstructionists.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that you could, the other positive thing about this week is that they at least managed to come out of these negotiations looking like they'd got a better deal, which they had. Going to argue about the extent to which it was a better deal, but it's definitely a better deal for the environment than it was before. So they've got through without looking like obstructionists. But as to whether or not this whole thing falls off the agenda, well, they're making the bet. The Greens are making the bet that it won't and it can't, and I'm with them on that. As in, the moment the climate news is getting worse. We're not going to have fewer natural disasters in the coming couple of years. We're still going to have this piece of shit mechanism that's barely reducing things and is in fact allowing new coal and gas. So I think the Greens are to some extent betting on, and I think they it's like they banked a little win this week so that they can keep fighting harder in the future. So I would say that in a week or two, we'll have a week or two of people saying, yes, the Greens have been very sensible and they've agreed to this sensible reform, and everyone's so sensible in the centre of politics, and welcome to the Greens for joining us there or something. There'll be about 2 weeks of that, and then I think the Greens need to get back onto it.
Yeah.
Well, I couldn't get a read on what the fossil fuel industry, and obviously the right wing hate it. The IPA released a thing saying that the Greens are a clear and present danger to Australia, which was annoying. It was close to the name of this podcast. It would have been better to get a shout out from the IPA on serious danger. But obviously they don't believe in climate change. They're going to hate it no matter what. They hate the existing safeguard, and any strengthening from the Greens they're going to despise as well. Adam was trumpeting the fact that coal and gas companies' stock prices fell in response to the announcement. I believe that they've since gone up to perhaps their highest level ever after that.
Wait, have they?
They've
that was like
certainly
my
tracked back
one
up.
fucking thing making me feel better on Monday was watching those share prices fall.
Yes, and I can't quite tell, I guess, from the reaction from fossil fuel executives as to whether they think these changes are serious or whether they're staying a bit muted because they think they can pretty much get away with it and it doesn't have much teeth. Have you kept across much of that, Nick, the kind of response from the fossil fuel industry and the right to this stuff?
I reckon that I'm sad to say, I think part of the reason that the share price went down is that a bunch of institutional investors that didn't really know much better saw the headlines saying the Greens have won a hard cap, and they went, oh shit, better pull some money out of gas companies. I don't think the gas companies are actually that worried, because, as I say, on an individual level, nothing in this legislation requires them to change their current plans. So I think individually they would go, well, I'm fine. To give another Woodside example, the CEO of Woodside came out last year and said, we basically bought enough offsets to get us through to 2030. Great. So they're literally saying business as usual. Yes. We've already got that covered.
Yes.
So the legislation is not going to change that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think they'll bleat about anything, the fossil fuel companies. They somehow managed to convince Australians that there's a gas shortage in Australia. They lie.
And that approving
they cheat and lie.
Gas fields is the answer. It's
beyond, isn't it?
I think when I was trying to conceptualize, trying to understand how I feel about this, because I think I still haven't been able to kind of settle on how I feel about it all week, partly because of the, insane complexity of the legislation and the deal that was made, which is why it's helpful to talk it through. But I think there's three key kind of questions or frames. There's the morality, like the actual, whether it's right or wrong to support this legislation, to vote for it. There's the strategy of the negotiations and whether you think that the Greens could have held out and got more or not, what you think the outcome would have been if they had blocked. And there's the politics of the Greens, the potential blowback from blocking it, or the benefits of flexing your muscle as a party that's not willing to block, that is willing to block bad legislation and be a real kind of opposition and not just be, the little brother to Labor who ultimately goes along with whatever they say and do. And like, I think when I consider all of those three questions, I do land on, and obviously I'm a fucking hack and I it's hard to convince me that the Greens have done the wrong thing, but I do land on like, I think the Greens have done the right thing here because it's not, it's not legislation that necessarily that makes things worse. So I don't think that it's bad that they voted for it. I'm not sure if they could have got more if they held out in negotiations. That's one I'm kind of unclear on, but who can say? And like the politics of it though, maybe that's one where I'm like, actually, I think there was a political justification certainly for blocking this. And I think that the public blowback was vastly overstated, primarily driven by the Labor Party and mainstream media. And I mean, when I've talked to people, even people I know who kind of generally like vaguely follow politics this week, and I've said, what did you think about the safeguard mechanism? They've said, the what? Like they don't even know that this fucking happened. And I think, like they absolutely could have blocked this and really flexed their muscle. And also I worry that, making these kind of deals that are so bureaucratic, like are so complex and, more technocratic, I would say, and refusing to really stand up to the Labor Party risks us just looking even more and more like an establishment party and losing what we've really made huge gains on, which is that anti-politics, anti-establishment thing of being willing to be different to the major parties. So politically, that's where I kind of land. I almost wished that we'd blocked this for political reasons, but I don't think that the Greens have, sold out in terms of trying to fight for the climate or, really let us down in that regard.
Well, I think the Greens parliamentary party is actually much more, is much stronger on these issues than what were traditionally regarded as their sort of institutional base. So, I talked about the ACF and the Climate Council. There's a bunch of organisations. There's a bunch of investors now in areas like natural assets management. There's private equity is flying into offsets. It's flying into, the likes of Macquarie Bank are now investing in, they're getting into the offsets and the biodiversity offsets markets. There are a whole bunch of people who desperately wanted not to kill the offsets market. And so that meant passing the safeguard mechanism. So I think the Greens weren't just wedged by the Labor Party and, the media trying to wedge them into a corner. There was also a whole bunch of
institutional power,
a whole lot of institutional power that was urging them to reach some sort of a compromise, just get the best that you could do. I really got a strong sense talking to a couple of the senior Greens over the course of the last few weeks that they felt terribly abandoned, and I just got the sense that it's 5 or 10 people by themselves in the midst of like the biggest kind of institutional investors,
the people who really run Australian politics.
People who've been in the environmental movement for years as well. Yeah. So they were on a hiding to nothing. I personally don't begrudge, Bant and his team for reaching a kind of deal. But, it's something that you said earlier, Emerald, like the morality question. This just doesn't even this isn't even part of our debate, like we're talking about a mechanism that 65% of, 60% of Australians think that you shouldn't have any more coal and gas.
Yeah.
Every scientific organisation says you cannot have any more coal and gas. So all scientists, all the UN, the IPCC, there's every reason, right, just to say no new coal and gas, and yet it was treated as a non-starting position in Australia, in the media, everywhere. It was like, oh, come on, mate, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
How could you not have new coal and gas? What? I had an argument with some clown online who said, this question of Scope 3 emissions, as in that we don't count, we've never counted the emissions that our companies export overseas. So why is that even a part of this discussion? And I said, there's a moral issue here. There's a moral issue about being the drug dealer to the world, to exporting so many emissions. And he said, well, I'm a pragmatist. I don't subscribe to the morality paradigm of politics. Okay, well, at least you're admitting it.
I'm like, this is what I'm trying to, there's a self-interest element to this as well, in that it is going to affect Australia. Global warming is going to affect Australia. In fact, even more so, particularly in certain parts of Australia than other parts in the world. Like, we are going to, and our economies are going to be drastically impacted by runaway climate change. And so it's like, even if you're like, oh, well, yeah, morally, I shouldn't have to just, lead the way and do more than these other countries. It's also like, yeah, but when you approve new coal and gas in Australia and it's burnt overseas, the global warming that results from that is going to lead to more floods, more fires, like more drought. It's going to lead to sea level rise. It's going to lead to, more disease. It's going to lead to food shortages in your country.
I know, right? And it's also, I would have thought it's a hugely risky economic kind of issue as well. As in, if other countries decide to put carbon border adjustment mechanism kind of taxes on our exports, or if they suddenly say, I'm sorry, the rest of the world just says no to new coal and gas. And like, we're putting all of our eggs in these baskets.
Stranded assets.
And leaves the whole, stranded assets, exactly.
That's not, again, capitalism doesn't care about long-term planning. It's like the next quarter, the next profits. As long as it is profitable, as long as those barriers aren't introduced, and as long as those major effects aren't kicking in a severe way to everybody on a very regular basis, despite how many scientists are, yelling like their hair's on fire and the planet is literally fucking burning and this shit is coming down the pipeline. Again, within the next 2 to 3 years, that's probably as far as most of these decisions are being made, certainly politically and also in the world of capital,
Good. Great.
Yeah.
Can't wait to talk to my therapist about this.
I mean, look, I think hopefully the debates can change. It seems like the vast majority of the population realise now that, that coal and gas are kind of not very good for the environment. And there's been the election of Teals and there's been the election of more Greens, and the major parties' numbers are slipping gradually.
Yeah.
Maybe in the next sort of little while there'll be a shift enough that there's more political pressure on them. I mean, I really wonder personally about how all of those Labor backbenchers can just stand by and pass this stuff. Do they not have kids that they worry about? Do they not sort of realise that they've just, that they've passed a legislation that allows gigantic new gas operations? As in, where are their heads at? Is someone going to say anything at some point? I'm sort of an optimist of the will at some level.
Maybe we're going to.
We're way over time.
We're way over time. Okay, all right. I mean, I think we just should confront this idea of the Greens blocking this legislation front on. Paddy Gibson, who's on the left, tweeted this out that I found, relatively compelling. If the Greens had held the line against any policy that allows new fossil fuels and relies on offsets, it could have created a protracted political crisis around the climate issue, and we need such a crisis. And I suppose this is what I keep coming back to, is like this idea of wheeling and dealing, politics as usual, compromise, sensible centre stuff. Like, all this stuff needs to be broken down and rejected. And there is going to come a point where we're going to say, we cannot keep doing this anymore. Something has to break, something has to change. And that may well involve, the Greens doing something like blocking the legislation. Osman Faruqi wrote a piece about how it was a capitulation by the Greens and a victory from the Labor over the Greens party too. I mean, I guess if the party was to say, no new coal and gas, this is our red line, it's backed by all the scientific evidence, this legislation allows for new coal and gas, we are not going to vote for it. And we demand that you come back with something that stops the expansion or the creation of new fossil fuel projects. That is at least a simple message to communicate to the public, a public that, as you say, is far more open to and far more on board the idea of having a hard line on these kind of issues. What would you say to that?
I'm completely with that line of argument, actually, personally. Personally, I'm absolutely with what Osman was saying. I would support a total, an attempt to put it this way. I think the safeguard mechanism, Look, this is my personal view is that I don't think it's going to actually reduce emissions much at all. I would much prefer have seen a stronger line. Having said that, I'm not in that position where you have the entire the entire world sort of weighing down on you. I wish that they had held out and made a bigger deal out of it. But, maybe they're preparing the ground for the next one. I don't know.
We can only hope so. That's the thing. It's like, you better not be, like when you say you're going to continue the fight against new coal and gas, you better not be fucking lying because...
I know, right? But it doesn't, the thing is, I think culture, politics follows culture. Like you have to build that foundation. And I think the Green Parliamentary Party, when they looked around, they just thought they didn't have the groundswell of support. There weren't enough people who knew about the safeguard mechanism. The big environmental groups weren't supporting them. The media were treating them like they were just blocking. I think, that's the room that they were reading, and I just wish that there was more support. And I think it's on everyone, from the likes of us up and down to sort of say, this offsets thing is a scam, coal and gas is a scam, exporting emissions and not counting those emissions, that's a scam. All these things need to be, just hammered home.
But that's why I think that, there is... But, to my mind, the victory with the concessions that the Greens have negotiated in this bill is theoretically, and I imagine what they're hoping for, whether this turns out to be reality or not, we'll see, but picking a fight with every single new coal and gas approval, like upping the pressure on the federal government when that comes around so that you can build that groundswell, that community, that civic support and winning on that basis.
I can see that working as well.
Nick Feik, this has been fascinating and great to go through this stuff with you. Thank you very much. Check out Nick on Twitter as well. We'll put a link through that show notes and check out his long read in the monthly on the great stock and coal swindle. Thanks very much for your time, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nick.
Good to talk.
Very depressing.
To put it simply, Prime Minister, certain informal discussions took place involving a full and frank exchange of views, out of which there arose a series of proposals, which on examination proved to indicate certain promising lines of inquiry, which when pursued led to the realization that the alternative courses of action might in fact in certain circumstances be susceptible of discrete modification, leading to a reappraisal of the original areas of difference and pointing the way to encouraging possibilities of compromise and cooperation, which, if bilaterally implemented with appropriate give and take on both sides, might, if the climate were right, have a reasonable possibility at the end of the day of leading, rightly or wrongly, to a mutually satisfactory resolution.
What the hell are you talking about?
We did a deal.
Call to action. This episode's coming out on Palm Sunday. We mentioned it in last week's episode, but Tom, you wanted to plug something relevant to this. It's a day where a lot of people are attending rallies for refugee rights, and you've got a gig coming up. You always want to plug your little gigs, don't you?
My little gigs, but I don't get any money out of this, so it's fine.
Okay.
Melbourne Comedy Festival is on Easter Monday. When Jesus came, is that when Jesus came back? Or that's the day we get off for Jesus coming back or something?
Good question.
Something like
Did
that.
he come back
I think he came back on the Sunday. Anyway,
Yeah.
This has nothing to do with that other than Jesus was a refugee. Myself and Will Anderson are co-hosting a benefit for the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne. It's a massive comedy lineup. It's super secret, but all the comedians who agreed to do it are very, very cool. It's going to be an amazing show as part of the comedy festival at Max Watts Bar. Easter Monday night, me and Will co-hosting. All the money raised to go towards the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, which do incredible work of supporting people seeking asylum and refugees. You can buy tickets through the Comedy Festival website. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Hell yeah. If you can't get to Melbourne for that gig, another good thing to do this week is to support the family of Aubrey Donoghue. That was, for anyone who might have missed this, the 27-year-old Aboriginal man that was killed, shot by police in North Queensland, in Mareeba, last week. The whole situation sounds really fucked. They were called out allegedly for a domestic violence incident, and say that Aubrey was holding a knife, but family members dispute that, say he was holding his phone. Either way, why did they shoot him 4 times until he died? And why is there suddenly no footage, apparently, even
That's
though there
so
were
weird.
15 police at the scene, 15 police all wearing body-worn cameras, and there's no footage of the moment that this man was shot and killed. So there's a fundraiser for funeral costs that's set up by Aubrey's twin brother. We'll put the link in the show notes for that one if you want to throw them some cash to give them a bit of financial support and, more time to recover, I think, as well as funeral costs will go a long way.
Good one. Rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. Give us a 5-star review, please. That helps spread the word. You support the show on Patreon, Serious Danger AU, on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. TikTok is going off.
TikTok,
all the info, go to seriousdangerpod.com. You can email us anytime. Hello at seriousseriousdangerpod.com.
Follow us on TikTok before it gets banned.
Please. Help us spread the gospel of the Chinese Communist Party. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Serious danger to Australia.